for joining us. I'm Diane Rehm. Last week saw disappointing numbers in housing, jobs, and the gross domestic product. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke gave a much-anticipated speech on the less than vigorous economic growth at a Fed meeting in Wyoming. We'll talk about what the Fed can do to stimulate this economy and keep us out of a double-dip recession. Joining me in the studio, Michael Greenberger of the University of Maryland and Alice Rivlin of the Brookings Institution. Joining us by phone, Alan Blinder of Princeton University and Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He's former director of the Congressional Budget Office. Throughout the hour, I'll look forward to hearing your ideas, your thoughts on the economy, where it's headed, and what can be done about it. Do join us, 800-433-8850. Send us your email to drshow@wamu.org. Feel free to join us on Facebook or on Twitter. Alice Rivlin, good morning to you.
Good morning, Diane.
Let me ask you about the tools that Fed Chair Ben Bernanke said he has to use, but not yet. What's he talking about?
Well, first, the Fed has done an awful lot already. They took their short-term interest rate, which is their usual tool, down to nearly zero. And then they went out and started buying all kinds of securities, Treasury securities, long-dated Treasury securities, which they don't usually buy, and mortgage-backed securities. So they've done a lot. The economy is recovering, but not very fast, as the chairman pointed out. So what else can they do? They can buy more bonds, especially treasuries, although they could buy more mortgage-backed securities or other things if they wanted to. They can't get the short-term interest rate down lower, but they can make a marginal move on paying the banks to keep reserves at the Fed. If the banks have reserves at the Fed, they're not lending them, so you might think they would take that back to zero, and I think they should. And the chairman suggested that was one tool. They can also talk. They can say, we're going to keep the short-term rate down for a very, very long time. They've already said an extended period, whatever that means. They could make it clearer that they're going to keep it there for even longer, or even give a date. I'm not sure what date it would be, but they could do something like that.
Alice Rivlin, she's senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, former vice chair of the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System. Turning to you, Alan Binder, Chairman Bernanke rejected the idea of the Fed temporarily increasing its target for inflation. Tell us why and what that means.
Well, what it would mean, first of all, the Fed has an unstated target for inflation of sort of just under 2%, and of course it depends how you measure inflation, but something like that. And what it means would be to raise that to 3 or 4%. The idea is to convince markets that as they look out, inflation will be higher than they now believe, so that real interest rates would be lower. Chairman Bernanke rejected that quite emphatically. I'd say by central banking standards, that was incredibly emphatic on several grounds. One that he didn't emphasize so much that I would emphasize more is that it's unlikely to be effective. I mean, the Bank of Japan, for example, has been told they should be doing that for a long time, and as people in the markets look at Japan with minus 1% inflation, they say, well, how in the world are you ever going to get to plus 3 or something like that? And I think we'd have the similar sort of problems, though we're not at minus 1, we're sort of at plus 1. So there's a question of effectiveness. And then there's the question of, you put in the word temporary. of whether it would be temporary. If this is temporary, you create a world in which the central bank keeps changing potentially keeps changing its inflation target, which is contrary to what central bankers have been trying to do for a very, very long time. And you also give up what most central bankers believe are the hard-earned gains of low inflation after many, many years of inflation that was too high.
Alan Blinder, he's professor of economics and public affairs at Princeton University, vice chairman of the Promontory Interfinancial Network. He's a former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. From your perspective, Michael Greenberger, how much can the Fed do, considering what Alan Blinder has just said about Japan, for example?
I'm very skeptical that the Fed can really have any direct impact on the crisis we seem to be going through or re-going through. As Dr. Rivlin said, they've already done so much, and their weaponry is, I believe, depleting. There are these measures they can take. I think they are measures by indirection that will not really have a direct impact, and a lot of it has to do with lowering interest rates. Or giving people confidence in low interest rates. And frankly, there just isn't enough credit around or money or need for ability to borrow, in some instances need to borrow. I think there needs to be a much more directed intervention in the economy. It has become politically controversial to say so, but I believe the stimulus, the Congressional Budget Office, just demonstrated, I think, conclusively that the stimulus that we had or are going through did work. Many people said, even when the legislation passed, that it wasn't enough. There were too many tax cuts, not enough putting people back to work. I know many people say, well, we've had a stimulus, and look, we're still in trouble. But I think the response, as demonstrated by the Congressional Budget Office, the stimulus was not enough. And obviously, there are political problems. The Republicans are not going to support a stimulus, so they say. But I think the president and the administration have to say clearly what needs to be done. And I think what needs to be done is there needs to be directed stimulus to put people back to work.
Michael Greenberger, he's professor at the University of Maryland Law School, director of the Center for Health and Homeland Security, and a former director at the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission. And now turning to you, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, what about that stimulus? Did it work? Was it not enough? Do we need more?
Well, thanks for having me on, Diane.
Sure.
This is a debate that will feed 1,000 PhD theses and go on for a long, long time. But I think a couple of points merit being made right now. I mean, the first is that as much as I love my old organization, the CBO, the report they put out sheds no real light on whether the stimulus did or did not work. The reports that they put out at the request of Congress basically rerun the same models that they ran in advance of the stimulus. Those models are built in ways that generate estimated employment and output impacts, but the models put out what you program into them. And so there's no new evidence, there's no new data, there's no real reason why those reports shed any light on the overall effectiveness of the stimulus. Point number two, I think, is that it's time to get past this debate on the stimulus. I mean, countercyclical fiscal policy, quote, stimulus in political parlance, is the domain when the economy is falling and you need an intervention to stop it. And that certainly was true at the beginning of 2009. Late 2008 was a very bad time for the U.S. economy. We have a very different problem right now. We have an economy that is growing. It is growing far too slowly for anyone's satisfaction, but it has been growing for nearly a year. And our problem now is that in the aftermath of financial crises, traditionally economies recover slowly because households have lots of debts and their assets have been gone down in value. Our governments have terrible problems with their balance sheets, how much they have promised to spend, and the revenues don't add up. And so there's one sector of the economy that has some health. That's the business sector. We need to think about this with a new eye toward what are things that would give the business sector confidence to go out and spend, what are pro-growth strategies, new trade agreements, cutting the corporate tax rate, real plans to balance the budget so interest rates don't threaten the future. Some steps that would give them the ability to go out and spend. That is the route to faster growth in the U.S., but there are no magic bullets. This is going to be a long, slow slog coming out of this recession.
Douglas Holtz-Eakin, he's chief economist, director of the Congressional Budget Office from 2003 to 2006, senior domestic policy advisor to the McCain campaign, and a member of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. Alice Rivlin, as former chair of the CBO, how do you feel about Doug saying that the CBO is now shedding no light on the situation?
I disagree. I think the balance of the evidence is that the stimulus did work. It worked in the sense of this very deep recession was less bad than it would have been. It preserved a lot of jobs. Let me make a specific suggestion for what to do now, and that would be aiding the states in a major way. They are contributing to further downward pressure on the economy by laying off workers and even raising taxes. The federal government needs to do something about that.
And we'll talk further about aiding the states when we come back. Alice Rivlin is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Do join us, 800-433-8850. Welcome back. We're talking about the economy, the state of the U.S. economy in particular, with Alice Rivlin, Alan Blinder, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and Michael Greenberger. Just before the break, Alice Rivlin, you were talking about aid to the states. I want to get to that. I also want to get to Doug's point about lower corporate taxes. So let's start with you and the aid to the states that you think would be a great tool.
The states in a recession do all the wrong things because they have to balance their budget. So what they do is cut spending, lay off people, and raise taxes or fees if they can. That makes the recession worse. So a good thing to do is to keep them from doing these damaging things. Any way the federal government can do that. The feds have already supported continuation of state Medicaid. That's a good idea. It should continue. But more general grants would help.
And I wonder, Alan Blinder, how you feel about aid to the states.